The Changeling, written and read by Chris Halton. It was, as I recall, a telephone call received by my secretary that instigated my visit to Bryony House, near the town of Fakenham in Norfolk. As a valuer and auctioneer of high-quality antiques and objets d'art, I own Richard Johnson & Co., a company I built in my name from nothing, and Bryony House promised the opportunity of having access to items of great or historic value, which, according to local gossip, have not seen the light of day for many years. The last occupier, Miss Douthwaite, died 2 years earlier at the age of 100, and since then the house has remained locked and shuttered whilst her solicitors act as trustees for the estate. As such, my role was to appraise all the antiques and furnishings there, and to provide the solicitors with a full inventory of these goods for eventual disposal at auction. According to the late Miss Douthwaite, all monies would be given to charity, as there was no heir. Bryony House, as it transpired, was a large 17th century timber frame property located in the Broadland district of Norfolk. It stood rather imperiously on a mound surrounded by its moat, which testified to the fact that the site dated to earlier medieval times, with a remaining stone drawbridge gatehouse as a solitary relic to more troubled eras. To get to the estate, one had to negotiate a series of winding bends on a 2-mile-long private road, which at times was deeply rutted and flooded by rainwater. It didn't help much that this was a cold and dark February day, and was only made more interesting by the temptation what lay ahead inside the house amid the prevailing winter gloom. Eventually I arrived at the property. Greeting me from inside a scallop-shelled pedimented Georgian porch was a very grubby-looking Mr. Chambers, the groundsman, a rather stout-looking man in his 60s, who sported a grey-streaked dark-brown beard and a mass of curly and unkempt hair. Unsmiling, he handed me a large bunch of keys, which he pushed into my hand and said in a thick Norfolk accent, "Good luck with that." His offhand remark prompted me to ask, "Why would I need good luck? I'm only here to appraise the contents of the house. You know she's still about here, don't you?" "Who on earth, my man, are you referring to?" he snapped. "Miss Douthwaite, that's who. I've seen her twice from inside the house, staring out from her bedroom onto the rear lawn. She looked real to me and stood for a few minutes as though she was waiting for someone or something." As ridiculous as his account struck me, I could see from his sweaty perspiration that he was genuinely fearful and plainly believed he was telling the truth. I told Chambers that I would be attending the house for the next few days in order to carry out a full appraisal, and that eventually a team of staff would be attending to arrange viewings and the eventual sale of the contents by auction. I also advised him that if there were any queries he could either contact my office or the solicitors handling the estate on behalf of the late Miss Douthwaite. "Whatever," he grunted. "When you want to hand the keys back, I live at the small cottage at the entrance to the drive." With that he departed in a small van, and I fumbled through 10 keys before eventually finding the front door key, which was embellished with a lion's head fob on a heavy stem. The keys looked to date from the period the house was built. Upon entering, I walked through a large pile of accumulated mail. Carefully picking them up, I put them on a side table while I dusted myself down, before removing a clipboard and pen to note down the contents for valuation. Looking around the oak-panelled hallway, I could see that my work was certainly cut out. There were antique wall and table clocks, 2 rather nice hall porter mahogany chairs, a delightful 18th century Dresden figurine, and some rather fine oils and mahogany furniture. A brief investigation revealed a great many antiques, and especially a library full of leather-bound books, with some dating back some 600 years, and mostly rare and collectible. Over the next few days, I worked my way through 10 bedrooms, a large drawing room, lounge and library. Each and every room had many items of antiquary, and my clipboard required frequent recharging with fresh writing paper to catalogue this extensive collection. And thinking back to my meeting with Chambers, not once did I see the spirit or ghost of Miss Douthwaite, nor indeed anything one could describe as paranormal. I was, though, quite convinced by the contents that there was a great fortune to be made at auction. Was I tempted at any point to slip into my pocket a rare piece of Japanese netsuke, or secret away a rather beautiful gold music box? Yes, of course I was, but professionalism and honesty taught me to keep my hands to myself, and to ensure that the late lady's estate would be duly disposed of in accordance with her wishes. On the last day, my work was solely confined to the attic. Here lay a huge clutter of old dusty tea chests, boxes, a myriad of odd pieces of clothing, and broken or discarded furniture. As I was sorting through the contents of one tea chest, I heard momentarily the shuffling feet of a dog walking across the hardwood floor. It sounded much further away, even though I knew it must be quite near. I turned around, and stood there quietly was a large old Irish Wolfhound. His shaggy old coat had seen better days, but his eyes seemed sad, and his demeanour was sullen. As I reached out my hand to stroke him, he turned quickly and walked away and down towards the attic staircase. Curiosity piqued my interest, and I raced after him, but he was gone. Nowhere, just nowhere to be seen at all. Thinking the front door must have been left open, I discovered it was still shut, as indeed every other door or window on the ground floor. There was no basement or cellar to worry about, as the property stood close to a floodplain. I was certainly confused and, dare I say it, a little nervous. Having returned to the attic, I recommenced an examination of the contents of the tea chest when I came across an old turn-of-the-century photograph of a young woman and a dog. Strangely, the depiction showed that of an Irish Wolfhound, which chillingly fascinated me. On the reverse was written in pencil, "Helena and her faithful friend Paddy, 1906. I mused that this photograph was over 80 years old, and yet that dog was uncannily similar to the one I had seen in the attic. Finding nothing further here of any value or interest, I returned to the library with the photo in hand, which I placed on a reading desk while I sat and pondered. The most obvious thought was who was the lady in the photograph, and the unlikely notion of whether the dog I had seen was a familial descendant of it. However, time was pressing, and I paid no further interest as it was now getting dark, and for obvious reasons the thought of being here at night made me feel rather unsettled. I packed my notes in my case and left, but decided to call at Chambers' cottage on the way out. Perhaps he could throw some light on the young woman and her dog. When I arrived at Chambers' gatehouse cottage, I could see he was working in his small cottage garden. He did not appear very amused at my intrusion, and stopped work begrudgingly to speak to me. He said in a rather dismissive voice, "Need some help, do you?" I politely replied, "Why, yes, of course, Mr. Chambers, if you have the time." He replied, "Well, it's getting dark, so you'd better come with me into the cottage." I followed Chambers inside into a rather small lounge which was packed with many mementos and various items of bric-a-brac, which reminded me of a cluttered Victorian home with its lit oil lamp hanging from the ceiling, giving a weak incandescent glow to the surroundings. After being invited to sit on a sole but comfy club chair, Chambers went to the fire surround and removed a pipe which he tapped against a metal fireplace. Having filled and lit the pipe, he inhaled sharply and said sarcastically, "I'm all ears, so please tell me more." I reached inside my case and removed the photograph, which I handed to Chambers. Upon gazing, he froze and stared intently at me and said, "Where did you get this, may I ask?" "I found it in a tea chest in the attic, and only a short while before a similar-looking dog appeared there staring at me. I assume the dog must be yours, as your home is the only one for miles." Chambers' sarcasm dissipated very quickly when he muttered scornfully under his breath while staring intently at the photograph, "This is not good." "Why isn't this good, may I ask?" He looked at me very coldly. "There is a legend regarding the hound. Before the present house there used to be a medieval manor house there. Lord Roger de Hamil, the owner, had a pack of wolfhounds which he used as hunting dogs." He went on to explain that one day while hunting he came across a poacher who had killed a large deer with a crossbow. De Hamil was so enraged that he set the hounds upon him, and as they ripped him apart limb from limb, he swore a curse on De Hamil and his estate. It transpired that the poacher was a practising witch, and a few months later de Hamel fulfilled the curse. A wolfhound apparently had caused his horse to rear up and throw him to his death from a broken neck. Chambers paused briefly, then relit his pipe and said, Where was I? Oh yes, after de Hamel passed, his manor house was destroyed by a fire, and the site remained as a moated ruin, until Sir Arnold Douthwaite bought the estate in the 17th century and built the present house. And here we are today. Miss Douthwaite, by the way, remained unmarried, and the Douthwaites have now passed into history with her death and no heirs. I then took the photograph from him and asked, I am still wanting an answer regarding the dog and Miss Douthwaite. I saw a wolfhound in the attic and then found this. You, by sharing this legend, only demands more questions, and I am completely confused. Chambers, for the very first time, smiled and said, I told you about a ghostly Miss Douthwaite earlier staring from her bedroom window, didn't I? Well, there is a rumour that she was in love with a mysterious man, and that she would stare from her bedroom window in anticipation of him returning. Well, he continued, I can qualify that because I have seen her, and I am fairly certain that the lady in the photograph is a very young Miss Douthwaite. And the dog? I can't answer that, I'm afraid, and I've never seen any wolfhounds around here. Much more perplexed, I thanked him and made my way home. As I had more or less finished my appraisal of the house contents, I decided to return one more time the following day to ensure everything had been covered. I arrived back early in the afternoon. For once it was bright and sunny, although very cold. I made my way to the front door when I glanced towards the surrounding parkland to spot what I first thought was a large wolf. It actually was the same Irish Wolfhound I spotted in the attic. By now I was pretty convinced the beast was a stray and probably existed on wild game found on the estate. He just sat there in the open sun and stared at me as I entered the house. I immediately put any thoughts concerning the dog and Chambers legend to one side and instead focused on the work in hand, which went rather satisfactorily in the sense that I had checked everything against my exhaustive list to ensure that nothing was missed, because that would for me be an absolute no-no. Satisfied after an hour that my work was completed, I headed for the front door and home. As I passed through the library, I saw on a small side table an open leather-bound book lying face down. That was odd, really odd. I was certain that I had left the library tidy with no misplaced books. The cover looked well worn and very used, which was quite unlike the others in the cases. I picked it up and realized it was in fact a notebook and was beautifully inscribed in copperplate handwriting. As it was getting late and the notebook remained uncategorized, I decided to read it at home and return it at a later date. And this, as I discovered, was my own undoing. The following day I returned to my office. Having spoken to the solicitors acting on behalf of the estate, it was agreed that the auction would take place at the house in April and on a date yet to be confirmed. My notes and lists were handed to my secretary to create an auction catalogue and price guide. Later that day, in fact at 7 p.m. in the evening, I settled down at home with a scotch to read the notebook I had found in Bryony House. The author was the late Miss Douthwaite, who had started her notes when she was in her late teens and living at the house with her mother. Her father, it would appear, was killed in the Zulu Wars of South Africa in 1879. When he served as a major in the Connaught Rangers. As with most notebooks written at a more juvenile age, it contained a number of penciled quotes from friends and best wishes from some of the estate workers of that period. She, by their comments, seemed a very popular and settled lady, and judging by her sketches of people and places associated with her life, she was artistically very talented. Around 30 pages in, Miss Douthwaite, or Helena as she was called, developed something of a love interest in her life. She mentioned a man called Bartle, which at first I assumed to be a surname, but apparently was not. And there were many references to him, which more than suggested to me that she was in love with him. There was a watercolour of him too, and with a mass of dark hair flecked with grey, he looked quite dashing, and reminiscent of a Heathcliffian-type character from Wuthering Heights. A few more pages further, Helena, if I can be forgiven for my impertinence here, wrote about their meetings and said she would sit by a large bedroom window overlooking the rear lawn for him to show in the garden. Quite why their liaisons were so secret was not disclosed, so I read further. Bartle apparently lived a solitary life in a hut on the marshes and hunted for game with a crossbow. He was, by Helena's comments, a well-read and privately educated man who came from a respectable family. At one point he had a commission in the army and served in Ireland, but he shortly after left the army and came to Norfolk to lead an isolated nomadic life on the marshes and well away from general human contact. Quite how he met Helena is not revealed, but it is fair to say that their relationship blossomed around 1900. As he was at least 20 years older than her, I mused that he might have been a replacement for her dear lost father. But I digress. Reading further into her notes, I see that her relationship with him continued in romantic bliss, with gentle reminiscences of her beau recorded on paper. But as I turn to the next page, I am greeted with nothing, absolutely nothing, as the pages hereafter remain blank. The only reference after this period was the photograph of her and the Irish Wolfhound. Could the dog be a gift given to her by Bartle? More importantly, perhaps it left the question begging, what happened to Bartle? I returned the notebook to the house and left it with a lot of journals in the library, with the photograph enclosed between the pages. I thought what a wonderful item it would be for anyone with an interest in the property's history. As agreed with the solicitors handling the estate, the house was opened in April to allow potential bidders to view the lots. As expected, there was the usual crowd of dealers and collectors eyeing up the contents in the hope of buying a bargain. The notebook, however, could not be found anywhere. I thought this very odd, as my staff are reliably honest, but none of them recalled seeing it in the first place. There was no reference to it in the auction catalogue, as it was enclosed with a miscellaneous collection of books. I dismissed its whereabouts as I had much to do in preparation for the auction the following day. As I left the house later that day to return home, I saw the same Irish Wolfhound I had earlier witnessed in the attic at the old medieval gatehouse entrance. He still had the same doleful eyes as he sat staring at me. I went over to him to call him to me, but he was having nothing of it, and he then turned and walked towards the car park set aside for the auction on the lawn, and in an instant, and before my very eyes, he was gone. How damn odd, I thought. But strange things that happen around this house seemingly never have any accountability. Later that evening, after a good meal and a glass of brandy, I relaxed at home and opened my attaché case to consider the itinerary for the auction. As I pulled a huge wad of papers from the case, I felt something larger and more solid. I put down the papers and found the missing notebook beneath them. How on earth did it get here? Extremely perplexed, I went to pick up the notebook when a previously unseen piece of folded white paper fell onto the coffee table. I picked it up and, having unfolded it, placed it on my lap. Then, in handwritten old-fashioned copperplate, I read a letter to whomever, signed by Helena. It read, "I have lost my truly beloved Bartle, but God has given me Paddy." The letter explained that Bartle had disappeared from the marshes in 1905 following a huge storm and tidal surge, which was believed to have swept him away and destroyed his shanty hut. Despite an organised search party to locate his body, the only living creature found on the marsh was a wet and bedraggled stray dog who was taken to Helena's home to recuperate from the cold. Despite inquiries to trace the dog's owner, nobody came forward, so Paddy was named and adopted by Helena. And there, it would appear, the story ended. The auction went without any hitches. Despite my original intention of disposing of the notebook in the sale, I decided to keep it to follow through with more research on Helena and Bartle, as their story fascinated me. The house remained locked and empty pending its sale through my company's estate services. Chambers, however, who was allowed to keep his gate lodge home as a precondition in Helena's will, and as such, was charged with looking after the estate until then. All seemed well, but was it? A few weeks later, I received a telephone call from Chambers at the gatehouse. He seemed somewhat in a lava concerning a probable homeless man who may be living on the estate grounds. The man was seen twice by him when out shooting for rabbits, and on each occasion he was found lingering around the rear of the property on the great lawn. When challenged, the man ran off into some nearby woods and disappeared. He was dressed in very shabby clothing. He couldn't describe him further, as he was always some distance away when approached. He had reported this to the police on both incidents, but officers attending some 30 minutes later found nothing on searching the grounds, and the house still appeared quite secure. Chambers was frightened, and perhaps with good reason. He lived alone in a very isolated part of Norfolk, and the man might be dangerous or fleeing justice somewhere. So, just to be sure, he left his rabbit gun loaded with cartridges and made it ready behind the entrance door. I told him not to panic and to call me first if there were any further reoccurrences. Nothing further was heard of the man, and eventually a potential buyer rang me at my office to view the house. Bearing in mind my earlier conversations with Chambers, I decided it would be prudent if I conducted the viewing. Arriving on a pleasant spring morning, I parked in front of the gatehouse and waited for my 10 a.m. appointment with Mr. Bohannon. As is so often nowadays with people, Mr. Bohannon didn't show up, so I decided to give him another 30 minutes before returning to my office. While waiting, I decided to go for a stroll around the grounds. In case Mr. Bohannon arrived during my absence, I left a note attached to my windscreen that I would return shortly. As I entered the rear of the house and onto the great lawn, I saw standing on the lawn the Irish Wolfhound dog I had observed previously, which looked strikingly similar to Helena's dog Paddy. The animal stared briefly at the house and then sat down to stare instead at me. Despite the obvious spookiness of all of this, it was happening on a bright sunlit day. I called to the dog, but he ignored me and ran instead into the woods surrounding the lawn. I followed in pursuit, but the animal once more disappeared. Realizing that my 30 minutes away from the car was ending, I returned to the vehicle to find Mr. Bohannon waiting patiently by my car. In fact, he was leaning his back casually against the wing. As I waved and approached him, I could see that this man was very well dressed in a three-piece dark blue suit. He had a mass of dark wavy hair with grey flashes on both sides. He was aged around the mid-40s and was quite tall and slim. He very much looked quite a dashing figure of a man. He stretched out his right arm and smiled as he shook my hand. With a soft, lilting Irish accent, he said, "I am very pleased to make your acquaintance, and before I say more, I must apologise for my delay in getting here today." Having assured him that there was nothing to apologise for, we entered the house. As we were wandering from room to room, he frequently commented about the house's history and its former owner, Helena Douthwaite. I was quite taken aback and asked how he knew so much. He responded by telling me that his grandfather used to know Helena, and that when he saw the house was for sale, he was tempted to buy it. After an hour of his company, he left. He told me that he would seriously consider buying the house, and if so, he would get back to me. I never heard further from him, and assumed he had lost interest. The house was eventually sold to a wealthy couple as a weekend retreat, and there I thought matters had ended, or so I had thought. In August of that year, I took a short break from work and stayed at a friend's cottage in medieval Kersey, Suffolk. Kersey is a small village trapped in time and is well known for its relative peace and tranquility, as it lies in a valley well away from any main road. The cottage's owner, a friend and former work colleague, Maria, was going away on business for a few days and had asked if I could stay and look after her pet dog Monty, who was an agreeable little fellow that was by habit a very quiet and obedient hound. She planned to return in 7 days, so having greeted her at the cottage, I met Monty too, and all was well. After Maria departed, I spent the day in the cottage with Monty, who seemingly preferred sleep and food to any physical activity. But like all dogs, I took him for his twice-daily exercise by walking around the village, which was incredibly quiet after living in Fakenham. Nothing much happened over the first 2 days, and the rear garden was a tiny courtyard with a small table and chair surrounded by brick walling. During the morning, and especially in the hot evenings, it was a great place to relax, save for the occasional intervention of a flying bug. Monty seemed very relaxed here as well, and we both got along extremely well together. And then it happened. On the third evening, I was again sat out in the tiny courtyard when, for no apparent reason, Monty became extremely anxious and started to pace around in a circle, looking up constantly at something which he had seen on top of the brickwork. I confess I could see nothing, and I became extremely concerned when Monty then started to bark and growl at this unseen intruder. Just what, I thought, was this invisible menace? After an hour, Monty, thank God, had lost interest in this invisible being and returned to sleep. Nothing untoward had further occurred, and I assumed not unreasonably that this was a one-off event. Still, the week was pleasurable, and rest from work was deeply appreciated. But that consummate joy was soon to pass when I returned home. A week or so later, I was walking through the town when a dog, for no apparent reason, started to snap at something around me. I couldn't see what the dog had plainly seen, and the owner, a middle-aged lady, struggled to retain control of it, and the further I walked away, the less the dog was interested in whatever had caused it to react so negatively. After Kersey, I was now starting to become concerned for my own safety and sanity. That night I was at home as usual working on accounts associated with my business when I heard the telltale sound of a dog pattering on a solid floor. The noise was rather faint and perhaps in an ordinary way wasn't noticeable. But the situation I was experiencing was not normal, and the sound grew louder as it appeared to get closer. And then, nothing, absolutely nothing. I frantically searched my home and nowhere did I find a logical excuse or cause for this noise. I then convinced myself it was probably due to my imagination, and foolishly, perhaps, I dismissed it. Over the next few weeks, I experienced many weird interactions with dogs who, it would appear, can see something that apparently is attached to me. I have to admit, I have never been a church-going man, as my faith in Christianity has weakened over the years. However, I still retained a friendly relationship with Father Maguire, the local Catholic priest, and it was to him that I sought information on an exorcism, as logically nothing else could explain what was happening to me. Father Maguire invited me to his priest's house, where his housekeeper, Mrs. O'Keefe, prepared tea and sandwiches as we settled down in his lounge to chat. The priest was a burly man in his mid-50s from Cork, Ireland, who was known and respected for his forthright views. Having listened intently to my tale, he reached over for a ham sandwich, which he bit into, and then said after swallowing, "Okay, what you have told me is very strange, that is to be sure, but is it a demonic entity?" I replied, "Well, I haven't described any of these incidents in a demonic sense, but I have turned to you, Father, as I respect you as both a priest and a wise man. Let's see what happens, eh?" He smiled before he called to his housekeeper, who almost on a pre-arranged cue brought into the lounge a small Jack Russell dog named Fingal. The dog stopped dead in his tracks and started to bark and growl insanely as his eyes appeared to be following something around in the room. So bad was the cacophony that he ordered Mrs. O'Keefe to take the hound back outside, which after a struggle she duly did. Father Maguire sat in silence before reaching for his mug of tea. He seemed palpably affected by what he had experienced, and his mug of tea was quite visibly shaking in his hand as he ingested a mouthful of that brown liquid. Having put down the mug, he intoned, "In all the years of priesthood, I have never seen anything like this." He crossed himself and continued, "Being more of a modernist in church doctrine, I would very recently have advised you to seek counselling, but this experience has changed all that and strengthened my belief in God." His words were sincere and brought some relief to the dilemma I was experiencing. Father Maguire, now much more assertive, said, "I think your problems emanate from the estate of Miss Douthwaite. The legend of Sir Roger de Hamel may have provided the tether of the issues with Bryony House." He continued, "And I have experienced the Carlisle as an Irishman as a child. Whether it is purely Irish people in rural areas are more frightened of them than the church itself, as these pagan legends have persevered even before the existence of Christianity itself." He ate another sandwich and continued, "Forgive me, this gives me an appetite." He pointed towards the diminishing pile on the sandwich plate and said, "Please do help yourself." I never had an appetite and politely declined as Father Maguire continued, "Do you believe in these legends?" "Of course, in the sense that regardless of whatever is claimed, they are founded from real events or experiences. I am not suggesting I believe, although I must admit I am slowly being drawn to change my views." Well, here is the official line of the Catholic Church and exorcisms. The Church are in the business of exorcising demons from people. These events do not suggest that you are demonically possessed, but are perhaps attracting them, and for what? So here is my view. Officially, I will give you a blessing, but I cannot perform an exorcism. However, I will supply you with holy water to use when you need it. Legend dictates that the Carlia cannot abide the stuff, so use wisely. If you need further guidance, I am here to help. And just to warn you, as I recall from my childhood, the Carlia can appear in human or animal form too, so be careful with all you meet. Having thanked him for his information, I left clutching a small glass bottle of water. Thinking on the priest's words, I decided to carry out research with regard to Bartle and to try to identify him and find out what really happened when he disappeared. I didn't believe in shapeshifters or indeed in Irish witches, but I did believe that something very weird and perhaps tangibly paranormal was happening around me. Through an Irish business contact who is involved in real estate, I discovered that Bartle was in fact Captain Bartle Manders, who formerly served with the 31st Infantry Regiment and left his commission in 1878, being appointed by an English lord to maintain his Irish estates as a land agent. His role included collecting rent from tenant farmers and to evict those who were unwilling or unable to pay. He seemed to enjoy that aspect of his work and cruelly evicted many families onto the streets. He regarded the Irish as scum and was unconcerned about the cruelty of his work. In 1880 he met his match when he forcibly removed an Irish tenant farmer and his family from an estate held in Tipperary. The tenant was unable to pay his rent due to ill health and asked for time to be able to raise the monies owed. Captain Manders was having nothing of it, and with the help of workers and the police, he lay siege to the cottage for 2 days due to the resistance of the family and their neighbours who came to their aid. Eventually, and with assistance from the military, they forced a battering ram through a wall, and the entire family on a freezing February day were dragged outside in the cold, whilst their house, complete with all that they owned, was levelled. In a moment of feigned generosity, Captain Manders offered them some thatch to keep warm if they were forced to sleep in a ditch. The father, a known and respected practitioner of witchcraft, cursed Manders and immediately died on the spot. At the same time, Manders himself fell into a coma and had to be removed to a hospital, where he lay for a month before he suddenly awoke and was discharged. He was never seen again in Ireland. I was deeply shocked at Manders' behaviour, which sadly was typical of the period, but the death of the farmer and Manders being put into a coma intrigued me. But the name of the evicted family eluded me as I was unable to ascertain from records any further information. Anyway, I thanked my Irish colleague for his efforts, but any further opportunity to dig deeper hit the proverbial brick wall. Of course, the one thing that didn't elude me was the dogs. I could no longer walk around in any public area, fearing that a dog might react negatively by barking and snapping at me. I can assure anyone that the experience is extremely unpleasant, regardless of whether the dog is attacking something unseen. A few days later, and still very much none the wiser about what was affecting me, I had a chance meeting with a friend whom I hadn't seen for several years. Her name was Dorothy Jellins, and she was the widow of an uncle who passed some years ago. She was very excited to see me when she arrived without introduction to my office, and to be fair, it was nice to see a pleasant face that could at least serve as a distraction for me. Dorothy, or Dotty, was a well-preserved woman in her late 60s, who still retained a good figure and looked good despite her age. As such, she was well dressed in a floral dress, a suede coat and brown court shoes. Having sat down at my desk and enjoyed an office coffee with me, I asked why she was in town. I had last heard of her living in Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk following the death of my uncle. "Well," she said with a smile, I heard from friends living in Fakenham that you are experiencing some very odd things happening to you. You are quite a talking point at the moment, and I am given to understand that dogs react oddly to something around you. Yes, I cautiously injected. She continued, but her voice seemed much more assertive. I know why these things are happening to you, and I am here to warn you. I responded with a startled voice. How would you know? Let me explain. I am a practicing medium with the gift of mediumship given to me following the death of Peter, your uncle. My friends here are occasional members of my circle, and it was not hard to understand what is happening. She continued as I sat in stunned silence. I know you are being stalked by an entity who is connected to a property you sold for a client. It exists because you are the guardian of a small notebook which was left for you. Do you still have it? Trembling, I exclaimed. Why, yes, I can't get rid of it. If you want to get rid of the entity, you must destroy the notebook. It is the only thing that keeps it grounded with you. She felt a certain hesitance from me and stretched both her arms across the table, grabbed my hands and said, staring directly into my eyes, I know how you feel about it, but you must do it. If not, it will remain with you for life, and I don't think you want to live like this. She added, You must return to the estate you received it from, and you must burn it within the curtilage of that estate. Trust me, you might experience some phenomena, and that might be unpleasant, but to be free, destroy that notebook. She dropped her serious stance and again smiled. Well, I have to leave to return home to Bury before it gets dark. You know what to do, and I trust you will do it to be free. With that, she left. I went home, leaving the office in my secretary's hands. I soon located the notebook and the photograph, and everything was safely together. Carefully placing it in my coat, I drove over to Chambers' lodge house. The rest of the estate was now privately owned. Having spoken to Chambers, he escorted me into the small cottage garden, which was overgrown and grossly untidy. Chambers asked that I gave him the book to destroy, as he too needed closure. I agreed and handed over the book. He flicked through the pages and smiled before saying, I'll burn it later tonight, as I have other things to do right now. He then placed the book into the jacket pocket of his green parka coat he was wearing. I was quite indignant by his actions and also puzzled. I requested he hand me back the book, as I too needed closure, but Chambers was having nothing of that. Now listen here, I retorted. I am not going to argue with you, so please give me back the notebook. He laughed and replied, I am not going to let you destroy my notebook, but you, my friend, are a different matter. A footnote. A few days later, Mr. Johnson, the owner of Richard Johnson & Co., was sitting at his desk with a small handwritten notebook in his hands. His secretary was in the next office, gossiping about him with a colleague. Both were concerned about his personality, which had seemingly changed. His secretary noted that he also became forgetful of names, and became almost like another person. The following day, Johnson failed to show up at work, and the company's safe in his office was open. Approximately £50,000 in cash was missing from the safe, along with his passport. Johnson's and Chambers' bodies were found shortly afterwards. It was logically inconceivable that Johnson could have been alive and present at his office, other than the possibility that he had a previously unknown twin. This could not be rationally explained because both had been dead over 2 weeks and had been savaged to death by a large dog. The cash and the notebook were never seen again. The end.